time for our next speaker, which is Florian Schäfer, who currently works at EVO. So Florian has been a political advisor at the Institute for Warm Oil Technique. So that's the institution for the German mineral oil industry, also a member of EUROFUEL. So Florian studied political science, economics and business law in Hamburg and in Los Angeles, and joined EVO in 2016, where he works on all political and legal issues. So Florian will talk to us about the world of incentives for low carbon fuels, taxation and other tools within the EU. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, and good morning to everyone from the US. Good afternoon to everyone from Europe. My presentation is going to be about incentives for low carbon fuels, taxation and other tools in the EU. And so, why is it important to talk about incentives for low carbon fuels? You all know, and we already heard about this a lot, that we need low carbon fuels in order to reach our ambitious climate goals. And so the question is, why is it not attractive to use them more? And we find two answers for that. It's basically money and law. So of course, these low carbon fuels are way more expensive than the fossil fuels. And so that's the reason why we need incentives to use them more. And how can we create these incentives? It's by adapting the regulatory framework we currently have in the EU and the member states. So what I want to do today, I want to give a short overview about the political framework in the EU and point out where we find incentives for the production and usage of low carbon fuels. And then we found three possible action fields of how to adapt the regulatory framework in order to increase the market share of low carbon fuels. It's energy taxation, it's the Renewable Energy Directive, and it's emission limits for new oil boilers. So let me once again quickly summarize the EU Green Deal, because it's important for what we are going to talk about. The EU Green Deal is a 300 billion euro investment program with the goal to transform EU's economy for a sustainable future. And this program contains a lot of undertakings regarding renewable hydrogen and low carbon fuels. For example, a zero pollution ambition for a toxic-free environment, accelerating the shift to sustainable and smart mobility, supplying clean, affordable and secure energy, and mobilizing industry for a clean and circular economy. And all these goals already include measures to increase the market share of renewable hydrogen and low carbon fuels. One strategy I want to put your focus on is the EU hydrogen strategy, which follows a three-step approach. First step is to install at least 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen by 2024. Second step is to increase at least 40 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen from 2025 to 2030. And the last step is to deploy renewable hydrogen at a large scale beginning 2030 onwards. And this strategy already consists of a lot of concrete measures. For example, the EU is about to set up an agenda for investments. EU will provide incentives for private investments and fundings. An innovation fund is about to set up, and EU will also pay for funded demonstration projects. So to sum up, in the overall political framework, we already see some plans of the EU to create incentives for the production and usage of low carbon fuels. And now I'd like to take a deeper look at the first of our three measures we identified as an incentive, which is energy taxation. So first, let me give you a quick overview of how energy taxation works in the EU. We have an EU Energy Tax Directive, which defines minimum levels of taxation on all energy sources. For example, it's nearly 36 cents per liter on gasoline, it's 33 cents on diesel per liter, and it's just 2.1 cents per liter on heating oil. So why is there such a high difference between these the levels of taxation? This has mainly social aspects as a reason. In the mobility sector, a steering effect is intended towards low emission cars and public transport. And politicians saw that in the heating sector, there are not so many options for the customers to switch to a different technology. And furthermore, a warm house and warm water is more or less considered as a basic right for everyone. So there are relatively low taxes on this on the European level. But what is important to know is that member states have the right to increase the respective levels of taxation. So they can increase the level of taxation, and I put up an example of how this is done with heating oil among EU member states. So Germany increased the minimum level of taxation by 4 cents, which means that we have a taxation of 6.1 cents per liter on heating oil in Germany. France did it even more. There it is 15 cents per liter, and Italy increased it quite a lot. There we have 40 cents per liter taxation on heating oil. So quite high differences among EU member states. And what is now our problem with the current system of taxation? Problem is that taxation is based on the energy content of the respective energy source. This means that a low carbon fuel has the same tax as a fossil fuel because the energy content basically is the same. And what we see as an option now is to switch to a CO2-based taxation in order to create incentives for the production and usage of low carbon fuels. So if low carbon fuels are not subject to tax, or if zero carbon fuels are not subject to tax anymore and low carbon fuels just a little bit, this reduces the gap between the fossil and the low carbon fuel. And I put up 2 examples on this slide, one Germany, the other one Italy. If we stay on the same level of taxation, so 6.1 cents per liter in Germany and 40 cents per liter in Italy, this would already equal a price of CO2 per ton of €22.50 in Germany and nearly 150 euro per ton in Italy. And that is a price, that a taxation price that a zero carbon fuel wouldn't be subject to anymore. And so we could increase the competitiveness of a low carbon fuel compared to the fossil fuel. Second policy measure I want to put focus on is the Renewable Energy Directive 2, which states that member states shall collectively ensure that the share of energy from renewable sources in the Union's gross final consumption of energy in 2030 is at least 32%. And there's a specific article for renewable energy in heating and cooling. It's Article 23. And it says that each member state shall endeavor to increase the share of renewable energy in that sector by an indicative 1.3% each year. And what is typical for a directive in the EU is that there on the European level, just the goal, the overall goal is set up, and the member states have the right to define the concrete measures on how to reach that goal. And in this case, we see as one option for the member states to implement the physical incorporation of renewable energy or waste heat and cold in the energy and energy fuels supplied for heating and cooling. So member states have the right to define own measures on how to reach the goal in the heating and cooling sector. And one option we identified is to establish rising obligations to add low carbon fuels to fossil heating fuel. In Germany, we already know that obligation for producers of gasoline and diesel in the transport sectors. There we had obligations to add biofuels, starting with 1.2% in 2007, rising up to 2.8% in 2014. So in 2020, we don't have an obligation anymore to add biofuels to gasoline and diesel, but we have an obligation to reduce emissions of gasoline and diesel by at least 6%. And this is still mostly done by adding and blending biofuels. So such a scheme could be transferable to heating oil to establish quotas in order to implement the objectives of the Renewable Energy Directive, and with such quotas, we could set a high incentive to produce low carbon fuels, of course. And this would create a secure demand for low carbon fuels because they have to be added to the fossil fuels. But on the other hand, would also increase the price for heating oil as they are more expensive. Last option I want to talk about is to establish requirements for new oil boilers. For that, let's make a short digression to the transport sector and to the mobility sector. Here we have a regulation for car manufacturers, and this regulation sets CO2 emission performance standards for new passenger cars. So the regulation sets an EU fleet-wide target of 95 grams CO2 per kilometer for the average emissions of new passenger cars. And the car manufacturers have to pay a fee. The fee is €95 per gram exceeding the limit. So this is a very strong incentive to produce low emission cars or electric vehicles. Electric vehicles count with a zero emission in that regulation. And what we are also fighting for is that the usage of low carbon fuels gets accepted in that regulation, which is currently not the case. It's no difference whether you run a car with a low carbon fuel or a fossil one. This is something we're advocating for on the European level currently. But to go back to the heating oil sector, we already just heard from Willem that currently the dominating policy measure on heating oil is just bans. More and more countries are banning the installation of new oil heating system. So what we see as an option is to, instead of banning the whole technology, to define emission limits for newly installed heating systems, and of course a limit which can be reached by the usage of low carbon fuels. With this, we can hopefully prevent new bans and also incentivize the usage of low carbon fuels. So to conclude, we defined three measures as incentives for low carbon fuels, which is first the CO2 taxation, pretty easy to adopt and will increase the competitiveness of low carbon fuels. The second one was quotas, which will secure the demand for low carbon fuels, but might increase the price of heating oil. And the last one was a regulation for new oil boilers, which is, of course, a relatively strict regulatory requirement, but of course still better than bans of oil heating systems. With that, I'd like to finish. Oh, my last slide fell out of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And with this, I'd like to give it back to Paul.
Thank you, Florian, for that roundup. The only question that I have coming is, so there's an awful lot going on, and there's one would find it very difficult to make a case that reducing carbon is a bad thing when you look at the planet. So in your view, how could industry make a business case to permit the sort of retention of liquid fuels, both in their fossil state, but moving forward and prolong that period to decarbonisation?
Yeah, of course, we see that we need a business case for companies, otherwise they won't produce low carbon fuel. So we need a market. And I think we can create a market for the customers by, if we manage to lower the price for the low carbon fuel, and if we need incentives, otherwise customers won't buy a fuel that is more expensive.